Well, thank you, Senator and Representative. We appreciate your taking time to be with us today for the 2020 Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. A reminder, we still have a full afternoon agenda yet to come. We're going to have a panel on school choice. We have an upcoming panel on combating environmental extremism. We have a panel on pro-life policy, why leadership matters. We're going to talk about the new entrepreneurial protection program. And then we're going to hear from John Gizzi and Dr. Paul Kangor from Grove City College, who will be talking about the state of the conservative movement. And we're going to wrap up today's activities a little later on this afternoon with comments from U.S. Representative Dan Muser. Up next, we have Corey DeAngelis. Corey is the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation. He is also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and he's executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute. Corey has a new book out. It's called School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Educational Freedom. And so, from the Reason Foundation, the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference welcomes Corey DeAngelis.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for coming out and watching this conversation today. I'm here to talk about school choice. School choice has always been an excellent idea because the public school system essentially has a geographic monopoly through residential assignment. It doesn't have any particularly strong incentives to cater to the needs of individual families because of that residential assignment and that geographic monopoly, but then also because of compulsory funding through the property tax system. They don't have a particularly strong incentive to cater to the needs of individual families. But it's even a bigger deal this year because it's one thing for the schools to not provide your children with an adequate education and to not have incentives to cater to their needs, but it's a whole nother discussion when the schools aren't even reopening for in-person instruction to cater to the needs of individual families. So the families are rightfully seeing that it doesn't really make any sense to fund institutions that aren't even reopening for their children. If a Walmart doesn't reopen, you can take your money elsewhere. You can go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or Safeway or some other provider of the service. The money follows the family to wherever they're best getting their needs met. If a school doesn't reopen, you should similarly be able to take your children's education dollars elsewhere. And that could be in the public school system if it reopens in the right manner, or they should be able to take their money to a charter school, a private school, a home school, or a pandemic pod or micro school option, which is basically the idea of the one-room schoolhouse. Just imagine if you were residentially assigned to your nearest grocery store and they got your money each week, regardless of however well they provided you with goods and services. Further imagine if they continued getting your money regardless of whether they reopened their doors to you. They would have a very different incentive than what they have today. And so I think this is why we've seen a very different response from the private sector than from the public school sector. And I will say, public schools all across the nation are not reopening with in-person instruction for the most part. Education Week has tracked these data for 900 of the largest school districts in the United States, and 3 out of every 4 public school districts out of the 100 largest school districts in the U.S. are not reopening with any in-person instruction available to any students at all. And contrast this with the response from the private sector. We have private businesses, private schools, private daycares, private grocery stores, private restaurants reopening, or they already have been reopening, or they're fighting to reopen, whereas on the other hand, you have public schools fighting to remain closed. And I think the difference is obvious to most people. It's one of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of how well they meet your individual needs. Again, if your Walmart doesn't reopen, you can take your money elsewhere. If your school doesn't reopen, you should obviously, similarly, be able to take your children's education dollars elsewhere. Why? Because the money isn't supposed to be meant for propping up and protecting a government institution. It's supposed to be meant for the education of the child. And our education funding system should reflect that reality and that priority of the student instead of the institution. And we see this with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives. Just think about it. With pre-K programs or Pell Grants and GI Bill at the higher education level, with Pell Grants, the money goes to the student, and the student rightfully has a choice to go to the community college if they want, but they can also go to a public or private university of their choosing. With pre-K programs, same thing. The money goes to the family, and the family can choose a public or private provider of pre-K services that works for them. With food stamps even. With that taxpayer-funded initiative, we don't tell low-income families that they must use their food stamp funding at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. That would be absolutely ridiculous. And we can argue all day about whether we should have these programs or how much we should fund these particular programs, but I think we can all agree that if we are going to allocate the taxpayer funding to different services, it should go to families, and families should have a choice. It shouldn't go to a monopoly and a government-run institution, regardless of how well it meets the needs of individual families. So if you do support pre-K programs and you do support choice and money following the child when it comes to higher education with the GI Bill and with Pell Grants, why would you not be for choice when it comes to K through 12 education? And the only reason that I can conjure up as to why there is this apparent logical inconsistency between these different sectors is that at the K through 12 level, the norm is not choice. The norm is that a particular institution gets your money regardless of how well they meet your needs. So there's an entrenched special interest at play here and different power dynamic when it comes to K through 12 education because, put simply, monopolies like to remain monopolies. You can't blame them for that. It's not that the people in the system are bad or have bad intentions. It's just that their incentives are set up in a way to delay reopening of schools and to not provide you with the most meaningful educational experience. I mean, look, we didn't see this with the grocery stores not reopening. We didn't see this with private schools. Private schools have actually been fighting against governments to try to reopen in different locations. In Sacramento, for example, there was a Catholic school or a Christian school in Sacramento area. They were allowing daycares to reopen, but they weren't allowing private schools to reopen, which first begs the question as to why is it okay to reopen a school as a daycare but not to reopen a school for learning? That doesn't make any sense. It's not that learning is causing the virus to be more dangerous or anything. So this school actually rebranded itself as a daycare. It trained all of its employees as daycare employees to pretty much show how ridiculous this regulation is and having different standards for different types of institutions. The health official in Sacramento actually told that school that, no, you're pulling a fast one on us. You can't actually do this. But thankfully, California is starting to allow some private schools to reopen. You have other weird things going on this year as well. The first time I saw it was in Gilbert Public Schools in Arizona, and a couple of districts actually. But then I started seeing it in California, Michigan, sprouting up in Virginia, and other states as well, at least 10 districts that I can come up with off the top of my head. They're not reopening schools for in-person instruction because it's not safe enough. But then they are reopening their same school buildings, elementary schools and middle schools, for daycare services. Again, why is it safe enough to reopen these as daycare centers, but not if you're doing the learning part? I think the main problem here is that, and oh, by the way, they're charging families out of pocket in addition to what they're already paying through the property tax system. In one location in Chicago, or a suburb of Chicago in Illinois, they're actually charging families up to $250 per child per week in addition to what they already pay through the property tax system, which most of us would classify in any other sector as legalized extortion. They're using their position of power in that they get your money regardless of the property tax system and asking for more money from families, essentially making families pay twice for a service that they have been getting all along any other school year. And I would actually argue it's arguably unconstitutional. Each state, as far as state-level constitutions, each state constitution that I know of has some type of education clause in it or provision that says that you must provide a free system of public education. And most people think of that as in-person instruction at public schools. Can't really say you're doing that, one, if the public schools aren't even opening their doors. But then two, more obviously, if you're charging families out of pocket for the child care services that were always being provided in these public institutions, can't really say you're providing it for free if you're charging people out of pocket. So families are looking at this and they're seeing, rightfully so, that it doesn't make any sense for the institution to get their children's money instead of them while their families doing a lot of the work and scrambling to find alternatives for their children right now because the public school system isn't there for them. And again, it's not because anybody in the system's evil or has bad intentions, it's just they have an incentive to remain closed and to not cater to the needs of individual families. And so the best way to fix this is to fund students directly. It would lead to more equality as well. Let's face it, school choice is already attainable for the most advantaged in society. Rich people can already afford to pay for a house that is located in a district that is residentially assigned to the higher quality government-run public school institutions. Rich people can already afford to pay twice, to pay once through the property tax system and then pay again for private school tuition out of pocket. Rich people can already afford to pay for pandemic pods or micro schools, which is kind of this new re-envisioning of the one-room schoolhouse. But disadvantaged families are being adversely affected right now from schools not reopening. This is most negatively impacting families that rely on two incomes to get by and single-parent households. So if we funded the students directly, just like we do with so many other programs, from food stamps to Pell Grants to pre-K programs to Medicaid to Section 8 housing vouchers, the money follows the individual person or the family. We'd allow for more equality by allowing more families from disadvantaged populations to be able to access these educational alternatives at a time when they need them most. I mentioned that some schools are reopening as daycare centers, which you think is pretty crazy, but there's also some other ridiculous things that are going on in some public school districts, including Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia. They're doing the daycare thing for one, but they're also doing this thing where they're not reopening the school buildings for learning, but they are paying bus drivers. So they're not returning the kids to school on the bus each day, but they're still paying the bus drivers to drive around town with empty buses, which just doesn't make any sense at all unless you see the school system as a way to prop up employees and protect jobs rather than how we should see the school system, which it was supposed to be about and is supposed to be built for meeting the needs of individual families. And the best way to do that is to fund the students directly instead of the institution. Again, just like how we do with any other institution. And it's even more important now than ever because the schools aren't even reopening. Even if you're using taxpayer funding like food stamps, if your Walmart doesn't reopen or Whole Foods, it doesn't matter that much. It's not a huge national debate about whether a particular grocery store decides to reopen or not. And why is that? It's because families already have a choice in the matter. They can vote with their feet and go somewhere else. We should do the same thing with K through 12 education that we do with pre-K programs and Pell Grants and food stamps, in that we should have the money follow the child. And so, of course, this makes a lot of sense to most people listening to this thing. Why would you prioritize an institution over an individual family and the needs of the child if the education system and education funding is supposed to be meant for providing a kid with a decent education and not supposed to be about propping up and protecting a government-run monopoly? Well, we have special interests in play that do not like these arguments, and they'll spew out a lot of myths in the debate. And so there's actually so much myths in the debate fighting against school choice and allowing people to take their children's education dollars to wherever they get an education, and so much special interest at play with fighting to keep the monopoly the way that it is. You have tons of myths in the debate. There's probably hundreds of them. We can only fit 12 in this book. I actually have a co-edited volume with Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey where we tackle 12 of the biggest myths in the school choice debate. And we also got invited chapters from different authors from different parts of the country to help us tackle these myths. One of the biggest myths that people hear in the school choice debate is the biggest argument that you hear against school choice. It's always about, well, what about the institution? What's going to happen to the monopoly? I'm sure everyone in here has heard the idea that somehow or another that school choice defunds public schools or school choice siphons away money from the public schools. No, it doesn't. School choice doesn't defund public schools. Public schools defund families. School choice just returns that money into the hands of the rightful owners. No one would say that allowing someone to shop at Trader Joe's defunds Whole Foods. Why would you never hear someone say that? Why would that be absolutely ridiculous to say? Because the money doesn't belong to any particular institution. It doesn't belong to Whole Foods. So allowing someone to shop at Trader Joe's doesn't steal money from Whole Foods. Similarly, allowing people to choose a private school for their children does not steal money from the public schools. It doesn't belong to the public schools in the first place. It's supposed to be for educating the child. And that's how we should structure K through 12 education funding. We should put our money where our mouth is and prioritize the families and the children, not prioritize the needs of a government-run monopoly institution. And then also, if this is your main argument against school choice, that it's going to defund the public schools, what does that mean about how you feel about what families would choose when giving a meaningful option? This is a pretty big concession that defenders of the public school system believe that they're not meeting the needs of so many individual families that families will vote with their feet somewhere else when given the option. Even though with school choice programs all across the country, families get lower amounts than what their children would have gotten on a per pupil basis in the traditional public schools. So that really says a lot that people, when given the option, opt out of the public school system when given the choice, even though it's less money than what they would have gotten in the traditional public schools. Take the two private school choice tax credit scholarship programs in Pennsylvania, for example. They're only funded at about 15 to 20% of what families would have gotten in the traditional public school system. If families are voluntarily leaving and only getting about 20% of what they would have gotten spent on their children in the public school system, that should really tell you a lot about how well the needs of families are being met in the traditional public school system. So that's the question that we should be asking, but it gets even worse than that when it comes to public schools, because public schools are partially funded based on enrollment counts, so if they lose some students, they do lose some money, but no state that I've seen in the country is completely funded based on enrollment counts. There are different percentages in different locations, but in Texas, for example, it's about 2/3 of the funding is based on enrollment. So what that means mathematically is when public schools lose students to school choice competition, they actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis. They get to keep about 20 to 30% of the funding for students who are no longer there. Just imagine if you stopped shopping at Whole Foods and went to Trader Joe's and Whole Foods got to keep 30% of your grocery bill each week. They'd be super happy about that, and I would similarly argue that the K-12 public schools should be ecstatic that they get to keep any money at all, that they get to keep 20 to 30% of the funding for students who are no longer there, and for them not having to provide those educational services for those children. So school choice doesn't defund public schools. A similar myth is that, well, perhaps the children that do not access the program could be worse off in the public school system, but there are 28 studies on this topic. 26 of the 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the students who remain in the traditional public school system. Why? Because competition works. Public schools start to see that they need to shape up and up their game in order to compete so they don't lose as many students. So that actually benefits the children who remain in the public schools. 26 of 28 studies on the topic find that. And it's because of competitive pressures. Then also it could be because they actually end up financially better on a per pupil basis. And so we should refocus all of our efforts on how the education funding should look. And I think a lot of people are seeing that it makes no sense at all to fund a government-run institution instead of the students directly. And they're really seeing that this year because their public schools have gotten so bad at meeting their needs that they're not even reopening for in-person instruction. So if we funded the students directly, it really wouldn't be much of a big deal in a debate, right? It wouldn't matter if the school district reopened or not, because then you could take your money elsewhere. And I actually believe the school district should have the choice to reopen. Teachers should have the choice to go back to work or not, but students need a choice too, and the best way to do that is to fund students directly. So I already said Pennsylvania has 2 programs that already do fund students directly to some degree. I think those should be bigger programs. They should be available to everyone. They should be universal to every family, regardless of their background. It should also be a higher funding amount. You shouldn't have to sacrifice 80% of your child's per pupil education dollars just because the public school isn't working for you. It should be funded more equitably across sectors. But then there's also the CARES Act funding. There's something called the Back on Track ESAs, or Education Scholarship Accounts, here in Pennsylvania that I do think is a step in the right direction at funding students instead of systems, funding students instead of government-run institutions. This would allow families to take, I believe, up to $1,000 for 500,000 different families, and that money would follow them to wherever their children is getting an education, whether that's in a private school, a charter school, a public school, or a homeschool option, including a pandemic pod. And that's how this should work. And I will say it uses existing CARES Act funding and reallocates those dollars from the institutions to individual families. And that's a step in the right direction. I think Pennsylvania is doing a good job with those types of proposals. But look, we really need to rethink how we think about education. Most families are seeing this, and there's a poll that just came out that saw a 10 percentage point jump in support for school choice amongst parents of children in public schools. It's not that surprising, is it? Because they're seeing that the public schools aren't there for them. The best way to ensure that the school system works for parents is to fund students instead of institutions. Thank you.